and the restaurant fell quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. Not loud quiet. Not the kind that follows a broken glass or a raised voice. This was different. Subtle and gradual. The kind of silence that spreads like a shadow across tables. It started the moment the door opened. Most of the guests didn't turn right away, and they didn't need to. The shift in the room said enough. Forks slowed. Conversation softened. A few eyes lifted cautiously, then dropped just as quickly. And the old man who stepped inside didn't look dangerous. He looked precise. Tailored charcoal suit. Polished shoes. Silver hair combed back with deliberate care, and his posture straight but not stiff. He walked with the calm confidence of someone who had never needed to rush. Behind him followed two younger men. Observant. Still, and not scanning the room obviously, but aware of everything. The manager noticed immediately. So did the shy waitress near the service station, and she had been rehearsing table greetings in her head all evening. It was her third week on the job. Still nervous. Still careful not to spill water, and still afraid of mispronouncing anything. When the manager hurried forward to greet the new arrival, something unusual happened. The old man paused, and not to look at the manager, but to look at her. Just for a second. It was brief but deliberate. Most of the staff kept their eyes down. Everyone knew who this family was, and not officially. Not publicly. But everyone knew. The restaurant belonged to distant relatives. The supply contracts passed quietly through certain hands, and the security company that guarded the building answered to specific phone calls. Nothing illegal on paper, but power rarely lives on paper, and the manager stammered a formal welcome in standard Italian. Polite, safe, neutral. The old man nodded once. Then his gaze shifted again, back to the waitress. She felt it, and the weight of being seen. And without thinking, without planning, she stepped forward slightly. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It wasn't rehearsed. It was soft and steady and unmistakably Sicilian. Not the polished Italian taught in schools, not the tourist-friendly phrases used in restaurants, but the old dialect, rural, intimate, and regional. A greeting that hadn't been spoken in that room in decades. For a moment, no one moved. The manager froze. The two younger men stiffened, and a guest near the window stopped mid-sip. The dialect wasn't just a language variation. It carried meaning, identity, territory, history. And it was the kind of greeting reserved for someone from the same soil. The old man's expression changed, not dramatically, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, and a pause that lasted one heartbeat too long. Then something unexpected happened. He responded. In the same dialect, the words were brief, respectful, curious. And where are you from? Her answer was even quieter. A small village near Palermo. There was no smile. But something shifted in the air. The tension didn't disappear, and it transformed. Because this was no longer a transaction between customer and staff. This was recognition. And recognition, in certain circles, changes everything. And the manager quickly regained composure, guiding the group toward the private dining section. But the old man walked slower now, measured, and he asked another question in dialect. How long had she been away from home? Her response was simple. Years. The two younger men exchanged a glance. It was subtle, but not invisible. One of them whispered something under his breath. Not approving, not disapproving. Just assessing. When they reached the table, the old man gestured. To her, not to the manager. He wanted her to serve. That was not standard practice. High-profile guests were usually handled by senior staff. But no one objected, and no one dared. As she poured water, her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear exactly, from awareness. She understood what had just happened. In Sicily, and dialect is more than speech. It's belonging, and belonging is powerful currency. Dinner began quietly. The conversation at the table remained low. Business was discussed, and though never directly. Names were avoided, places referenced indirectly. The kind of coded language people use when they assume walls might have ears. But every so often, and the old man would look up and ask her something small. About her village. About the church near the olive trees. About the old stone well in the square, and details no outsider would know. Each answer tightened something invisible between them. The guests in the restaurant tried to return to normal, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding. Halfway through the meal, one of the younger men stepped away to take a call, and his tone outside was sharp, controlled, defensive. When he returned, the old man's posture shifted, slightly more rigid. He asked her one final question. And do you still speak it often? She hesitated, No. He nodded once. You should, that was all. But it wasn't advice. It sounded like instruction. When the bill arrived, and it was waved away. Not by the manager. By the old man. And before leaving, he did something that made every staff member stiffen. He placed his hand lightly over hers, and not inappropriate. Not lingering. Just enough to be deliberate. In dialect, he said something that no one else in the room fully understood, except her, and the words translated loosely to, "Some roots are never cut." And then he left. The silence that followed was heavier than the one at the beginning, and because now the room understood something had shifted. The manager approached her carefully. What did he say? She didn't answer immediately. Because she wasn't sure, and not of the words, but of the meaning. The next day, a black car waited across the street from the restaurant. It didn't block traffic. It didn't break laws. It just waited, and when her shift ended, it didn't move closer. It followed. At a distance. Not threatening. Not protective. Just present. And that's when she realized, and that one greeting had done more than freeze a room. It had put her on a map she never intended to be on. And once certain families notice you, they rarely forget, and the car kept its distance the entire walk home. Not close enough to feel aggressive, not far enough to dismiss as coincidence. It moved when she moved, and stopped when she stopped, turned when she turned. She told herself it was nothing. Big cities create patterns that look intentional. Vehicles overlap roads, and people share sidewalks. It didn't mean she was being watched. But when she reached her apartment building and glanced back one last time, the car was still there, an engine running, lights off. The next morning it was gone. Work resumed as usual. Orders, trays, quiet smiles. No one mentioned the night before, and the manager avoided her eyes. The senior waitstaff whispered near the espresso machine, stopping when she approached. News travels fast in certain communities, and especially when it involves someone powerful enough to silence a room without raising his voice. By lunchtime, she noticed something else. 2 new faces at a corner table, and not dining, not really. Coffee cups barely touched. Jackets too structured for casual wear. Eyes too observant. They weren't staring directly at her, but they were aware of her. The kind of awareness that isn't accidental. She kept her head down, focused on tasks, repeated her steps in her mind. Don't react, and don't assume. Don't invite attention. But attention had already arrived. That evening, the manager called her into the office. His tone was careful, measured, and special request had come in. A private event in 3 nights. Select guest list. Limited staff. She had been specifically asked to work it. Her stomach tightened, and she asked who made the request. The manager didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. When she returned home, there was an envelope slid beneath her door. No stamp, and no address. Just her name written in clean, deliberate script. Inside was a small card and address, a time, no explanation. She didn't sleep much that night, and memories surfaced she hadn't revisited in years. The village she'd mentioned, the narrow stone streets. The way dialect wasn't just spoken, it was lived. In small towns, and language carries history. It carries alliances. It carries quiet understandings outsiders don't grasp. Back there, greetings weren't just politeness. They were signals, and by the 3rd day, the black car returned. This time it didn't follow. It parked outside her building and waited. When she stepped out, and one of the younger men from the restaurant leaned lightly against the hood. Calm, composed. He didn't smile. He opened the passenger door. No threats, no pressure, and just expectation. The ride was silent. The address on the card led to a private estate outside the city. High walls, iron gates, security that looked subtle but wasn't, and inside, the gathering was already underway. Low lighting, classical mute conversations carried in soft tones. The kind of event that exists outside official calendars, and she was guided toward the kitchen. Professional chefs moved efficiently, but even they seemed careful, controlled. No unnecessary talk. Then she saw him again, and the old man stood near a large window overlooking the grounds. His posture the same, his presence unchanged. When he turned and noticed her, he nodded once, and as if this outcome had been inevitable. He spoke first, again in dialect. You came. It wasn't a question. She answered carefully. I was asked. A pause, and then he gestured toward the room. Do you know why you're here? She didn't, but she suspected it wasn't about serving food. He studied her expression, and searching for something, fear perhaps, or ambition. Instead, he found restraint that seemed to satisfy him. He began speaking slowly, almost reflectively, and about how language fades in cities, how dialect becomes something people hide to fit in, how younger generations trade identity for comfort. His tone wasn't angry, and it was disappointed. Then he asked her to repeat the greeting she had spoken at the restaurant. Her voice trembled slightly this time, but she did, and the room didn't freeze like before. But it listened. The older guests exchanged glances. The younger ones watched carefully. What she began to understand was this, and the greeting hadn't just been nostalgic, it had marked her. In that world, dialect was a test, a way to measure authenticity, loyalty, origin. And by speaking it fluently and naturally, she had proven something. Something she never intended to prove. The old man stepped closer. There are few left who remember it properly, he said softly, and fewer who speak it without shame. He wasn't offering praise. He was assessing value. Across the room, one of the younger men looked uneasy. Protective, perhaps, and/or threatened. Because power shifts quietly. And influence doesn't always come from position. Sometimes it comes from belonging. The evening continued, but she wasn't treated like staff. She was seated briefly. Asked about her family, her upbringing, who she knew back home. Every question felt casual. None were. And she answered carefully, truthfully, but sparingly. When the event ended, the old man approached one final time. He handed her a small piece of paper, a phone number, and this time not prepaid. If you ever need anything, he said calmly, use it. No smile, no reassurance, just fact. The ride back was quieter than before, and the black car dropped her off without comment. But the following week, things changed. Suppliers began greeting her differently. Staff treated her with subtle caution, and, one afternoon, a delivery that had been delayed for months suddenly arrived approved without explanation. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't made a call, but the number remained folded in her drawer. Uncalled, untouched, yet powerful. And that was the real tension. Because in certain circles, association alone is influence, and an influence, even unclaimed, comes with expectations. What she didn't know yet was that someone else had noticed the shift, and someone who didn't see her greeting as cultural respect, but as alignment, and in environments built on quiet alliances. Perceived alignment can be dangerous, and the first warning came not from a threat, but from a question. Why were you invited? It was asked by one of the senior staff members, voice low, careful, and she didn't have an answer. But she could feel something changing. The greeting that froze a room had opened a door. And now, that door refused to close. Perfect. And I'll continue seamlessly from where it ended, keeping the same tone, same pacing, no headings, no host intro, no moral conclusion. 2. And the greeting that froze a room had opened a door. And now, that door refused to close. The question lingered in her mind long after it was spoken. Why were you invited? And she replayed the evening at the estate again and again. The measured conversations. The way eyes followed her when she moved, and the way the old man listened more than he spoke. Nothing had been explicit. Nothing had been threatening. But nothing had been casual either. 2 nights later, and the black car didn't appear. Instead, a different presence made itself known. A man she had never seen before entered the restaurant just before closing, and he didn't order food. He didn't sit. He stood near the entrance as if unsure whether to step further inside. When she approached to offer assistance, and he studied her carefully, "You're from Palermo," he said quietly. Not in dialect, in standard Italian. She hesitated. Yes, he nodded slowly, and as if confirming something already known. Be careful what language you use in this city. Then he left, no explanation. No return address, and the manager pretended not to notice. That was when she understood something important. There were multiple currents moving beneath the surface, and not all of them flowed in the same direction. Over the next week, small changes accumulated. The regular suppliers were suddenly punctual, and reservations that once took effort to secure were approved instantly. A local official who had ignored the restaurant's permit renewal for months signed it without delay, and her name was never mentioned. But her presence seemed to carry weight. One evening, one of the younger men from the estate returned alone. He chose a table near the back, and out of sight but not out of awareness. When she approached, he didn't look up immediately. "You've been noticed," he said eventually. "By whom?" she asked carefully, and he finally met her eyes. "By people who don't appreciate surprises." He didn't elaborate. Instead, he asked her something unexpected. "Why did you speak that way?" And she told the truth. It felt natural. He studied her face, searching for ambition, for calculation. He didn't find it. That unsettled him more than if he had. "And you understand what it meant to him, don't you?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "It meant home." He shook his head slightly. "It meant loyalty." And that word changed the temperature of the conversation. She had not pledged anything. She had not agreed to anything. She had spoken a greeting learned as a child, but in certain environments, gestures are interpreted as commitments. The next morning, she received another envelope. Inside was not an address this time, and it was a newspaper clipping. An article about a business merger that had quietly fallen apart, and two companies that had been negotiating suddenly ended talks after a cultural disagreement. One of the companies had ties to the old man's extended network, and the other did not. There was a handwritten note beneath the clipping. Words carry consequences. No signature. She began to understand that she was no longer invisible, and her dialect had not only impressed one man. It had signaled alignment to others. And in circles where history runs, deep alignment is rarely neutral. A week later, and she was summoned again. This time not to an estate. To a modest office above a shipping warehouse near the docks. The setting was deliberately unremarkable. Inside, and the old man sat alone. No guards in sight. No music. Just a desk, two chairs, and a window overlooking containers stacked like silent witnesses. He didn't ask her to sit, and he asked her a question instead. "Do you know what dialect protects?" She remained quiet. He answered for her. "It protects memory, and memory protects order." He explained, and slowly, that his generation believed identity was a form of structure. Language reminded people where they came from, who they owed, what lines not to cross, and modern cities blurred those lines. Younger men relied on money. Older men relied on history. When she spoke in dialect, she reminded him of something older than business, and something stable, something he trusted. But trust in that world was never free. He leaned back slightly. "Some people think you are closer to me than you are," and she felt her pulse rise, "and that makes them cautious or resentful." He let the silence stretch. "You have done nothing wrong," he said calmly. "But perception shapes reality, and he wasn't threatening her. He was explaining the landscape." She finally spoke. "I didn't ask for this." He nodded once. "No one ever does." And that was the closest he came to sympathy. He then made something clear. "You will not call the number I gave you. It wasn't advice. It was instruction, and your safety depends on distance." The irony was sharp. The very connection that elevated her also endangered her. As she left the warehouse office, and she noticed two men standing across the street, pretending to check their phones. They weren't pretending well, and one of them glanced up just long enough to confirm her identity. The pressure was no longer abstract. It was tangible. Over the next month, and subtle tension grew within the restaurant. Certain deliveries arrived damaged. A reservation of influential guests was canceled abruptly, and a rumor circulated that management was under investigation for tax discrepancies. Nothing concrete, just enough to create instability, and the manager pulled her aside one evening. "You've become a variable," he said quietly. She didn't argue. He wasn't blaming her. He was acknowledging reality, and in environments built on equilibrium, even unintended influence disrupts balance. Meanwhile, and the younger man who had questioned her about loyalty began visiting more frequently. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he simply observed. One evening after closing, and he stayed behind. "There are factions," he said quietly. She listened. "Not everyone respects old traditions. Not everyone believes dialect should define hierarchy, and some believe the future belongs to those who adapt. And they see you as a symbol." "Of what?" she asked. "Of the old man's nostalgia." The word carried weight, and nostalgia in powerful circles can be dangerous. It suggests preference bias, softness. Softness invites challenge. Then came the first real test, and a guest approached her table one evening and deliberately greeted her in broken Sicilian. Incorrect phrases. Forced accent. It was mockery disguised as flattery, and she responded politely in standard Italian. The guest smiled thinly. "So you only use it for certain people." The message was clear. She was being watched,
a message
measured,
from the family.
and that night, the black car returned. But it didn't park outside her building.
Gentlemen,
it parked across
a
from
message
the
from the
restaurant.
family.
Engine off. Waiting. The following day, and news broke that one
Gentlemen,
of the younger
a
men from
message
the
from the
estate had
family.
stepped down from a leadership role in a family-owned logistics company.
Gentlemen,
No
a
scandal.
message from the family.
No explanation, and just restructuring. But she knew better. Power was adjusting.
Gentlemen, a
Because
message from the
perception had
family.
shifted. Her simple greeting had exposed generational fault lines, and
Gentlemen,
tradition versus
a message
adaptation,
from the family.
memory versus ambition. She began limiting her interactions, speaking less,
Gentlemen,
moving quietly,
a message from the
avoiding
family.
attention. But influence, once attached, and doesn't fade easily. One
Gentlemen,
evening, as she walked
a
home
message
alone,
from the family.
footsteps matched her from a distance. Not close, not hurried. Just steady.
Gentlemen,
She
a
turned a
message
corner
from the
abruptly,
family.
and the footsteps paused, then continued. Her heart raced, but she kept
Gentlemen,
her pace measured.
a message
No
from the
running,
family.
no panic. She reached her building and stepped inside, and the footsteps stopped outside. She waited behind the door, listening silence. The next morning, a bouquet of olive branches rested against her door. No note, and no explanation. A reminder, roots, memory, alignment. But also warning, the old man never contacted her directly again. The number remained unused, and the car appeared less frequently. But the ripple effects continued. Over time, the restaurant stabilized. Suppliers returned to normal schedules. Rumors faded, and the younger generation within the network began asserting themselves publicly, shifting emphasis toward modern expansion rather than cultural preservation. And slowly and subtly, the attention around her softened. But it never disappeared completely, because in certain environments, once you are recognized, you are cataloged. Years later, and guests would still whisper when she greeted tables in standard Italian. Some would wonder if she was connected. Others would dismiss it as urban myth, and she kept the dialect buried, not out of shame, but out
I
of
see you
understanding.
found the place.
Language had
Down there
opened a
is the
door she
operation.
never intended to walk through, and a door that revealed how
I see you
fragile
found the
balance can
place.
be when identity
Down there is the
intersects with
operation.
power. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room
I
isn't
see
a
you
weapon.
found the place.
It's recognition.
Down there is the
And
operation.
sometimes all it takes to freeze a room is a greeting
I see
that
you
reminds
found the
powerful
place.
men who they
Down
used to
there
be.
is the operation.
The restaurant still operates, and the estate still
I
hosts
see you
quiet
found the
gatherings.
place.
The
Down
dock
there
still
is the
receives
operation.
shipments under watchful eyes, and somewhere within that
I
layered
see you
city,
found the
and
place.
echo of a
Down there
Sicilian
is the
dialect
operation.
lingers, unspoken, but never forgotten, but silent.
I see
in
you found the
environments
place.
shaped by quiet
Down there
influence
is the operation.
never permanent, and months passed without incident. The
I
black
see
car
you
stopped
found the
appearing.
place.
The
Down there is the
unfamiliar faces
operation.
at corner tables faded away, and the younger man who once questioned her about loyalty no longer visited. On the surface, everything had returned to normal. But normal had changed, and she noticed it in small ways. Certain guests would glance at her with a second of hesitation before speaking, and a few older patrons addressed her more formally than necessary. Even the manager's tone carried a trace of caution, as though she had become something fragile or volatile, and what she didn't realize was that her name had circulated in conversations she would never hear, not as a threat, not as an ally, but as a symbol. In private meetings, and some had described her as proof that the old guard still valued heritage over strategy. Others argued she was irrelevant, an accidental moment elevated by nostalgia, and the debate wasn't about her. It was about direction, tradition or transition, and in those circles, ideological disagreements rarely remain abstract. One evening, and nearly a year after the greeting, she was finishing her shift when the younger man reappeared.
Good evening, sir.
Alone. He looked
A greeting
different,
can change
more
everything.
tired, less certain. He asked for coffee, and she brought
evening,
it without
sir.
speaking.
A greeting
After a
can
long
change
silence,
everything.
he finally said he's stepping back. She didn't ask who.
Good evening,
She
sir.
knew. Health
A
reasons,
greeting can
he
change
continued
everything.
carefully and officially. But that wasn't the whole story.
Good evening,
Leadership
sir.
was shifting.
A
The
greeting can
generation that
change
valued
everything.
dialect, village ties, unspoken codes, and they were
Good evening,
losing
sir.
ground to those who valued
greeting can
expansion,
change everything.
technology, international contracts. The old ways
Good
were
evening,
becoming
sir.
symbolic rather
A
than
greeting
structural,
can change
and
everything.
symbols, and when no longer useful, are often set aside.
Good evening, sir.
She listened without
A
interrupting.
greeting can change
He
everything.
studied her face as if searching for regret. Do you understand
evening,
what
sir.
happened? And he
A
asked
greeting
quietly.
can change everything.
She answered honestly. Not completely. He nodded.
Good
Your
evening,
greeting
sir.
reminded him of
A
something he
greeting
thought
can
was
change
fading.
everything.
It strengthened his resolve, and it slowed certain decisions.
Good evening, sir.
It made him
A
hesitate
greeting
where he
can
might not
change
have.
everything.
She absorbed that. Hesitation in powerful networks creates opportunity, and opportunity invites challenge. Challenge creates instability, all from a greeting. The younger man leaned back. Some people blamed you. She held his gaze. Did you? And he didn't answer immediately. At first, he said. That honesty surprised her. But then I realized something. He paused. It wasn't the greeting that caused disruption, and it was the fear of what it represented. Fear of loyalty rooted in memory. Fear of influence not tied to money. Fear of the past resurfacing at inconvenient times. Outside, and traffic moved steadily along the street. Ordinary city noise. Ordinary life. Inside, the conversation carried the weight of quiet systems adjusting. He finished his coffee. And he won't return to the restaurant again, he said. She understood. A chapter had closed. But closing chapters rarely erase what happened within them. Weeks later, and news circulated quietly that the old man had retired fully from public business affairs. No dramatic announcement, just absence. His presence at events dwindled, and his estate hosted fewer gatherings. Decisions were now made by committees rather than by a single voice shaped by decades of memory. And the olive branches that once appeared outside her door stopped entirely. The black car never returned. But something else changed, and the dialect she had buried began resurfacing in unexpected places. Not spoken by her, spoken by others. Older suppliers greeted each other softly in fragments of it, and a cook from the kitchen used a phrase while chopping herbs. A delivery driver muttered a proverb under his breath. It was subtle, but deliberate, and it was as if the greeting had reminded others of something they'd quietly abandoned, and that reminder had taken root. She never used the number he had given her, but eventually, she destroyed it. Not out of rejection, but out of closure. Years passed. The restaurant renovated. Management shifted, and new staff arrived who had never witnessed that frozen moment when the door first opened. To them, she was simply experienced, steady, quietly confident. But every so often, an older guest would step inside. Their eyes would recognize her, and for a split second, the air would change again. Not with fear, not with tension, with memory. And the younger generation who had once viewed her as a symbol of nostalgia gradually built their own systems. More corporate, more visible, less tied to soil and dialect. But even in those modern structures, cultural identity lingered beneath the surface. Because power evolves, it doesn't erase. One autumn evening, and nearly 5 years after that first greeting, she walked past a small gathering outside a cultural center in the city. Voices drifted into the street. Not standard Italian, and not English. Sicilian dialect, young voices, practicing, laughing, learning. She paused without meaning to. The words felt different now, less heavy, less loaded. And inside the center, a banner read Language and Heritage Night. Open to all, no security, no black cars, no coded conversations. Just memory shared openly. And she didn't go inside. But she listened for a moment. And for the first time, the dialect didn't feel like a signal. It felt like language again. And the restaurant lights glowed behind her as she returned to work. Guests filled the tables. Conversations layered softly over clinking glasses. And when the door opened that night, no room froze. No silence spread. It was just another evening.
A message from the family.
But somewhere in the quiet spaces between tables, and in the way older guests nodded slightly when she passed,
a message from the family.
In the subtle respect she carried without asking for it, the echo of that greeting remained.
Gentlemen, a message
not
from
as
the family.
Alignment, and not as loyalty, not as power, but as proof that even in environments shaped by influence and hierarchy, and a single moment of authenticity can ripple outward in ways no one anticipates.
Gentlemen, a message
the city
from the
continued
family.
to move. Business adapted. Generations shifted. And
Gentlemen,
the shy
a
waitress
message
who
from the
once
family.
froze a room learned something no one had taught her. That sometimes the most
Gentlemen,
powerful thing
a
you can
message from the
reveal about
family.
yourself isn't ambition and its origin. And once revealed, it can
Gentlemen,
never be
a
entirely
message
unseen.
from the family.
Time softened the sharp edges of that year, but it never erased it completely. And she stayed at the restaurant longer than anyone expected. Long enough to become part of its rhythm. Long enough for new staff to assume she had always been there. And long enough that the story of that night turned into something half-believed, passed quietly between older employees like folklore. And they would lower their voices when telling it. The night the room went silent. The night a dialect changed the air. But the details blurred over time, and some versions exaggerated. Others minimized. That was natural. Stories reshaped themselves to survive. What didn't change was the way certain people still regarded her, and not with fear. Not even with curiosity. With recognition. Years after the old man stepped back, the network he once influenced continued operating in quieter and more corporate forms. The younger leadership favored contracts over code, international partnerships over local allegiances. They wore sharper suits and spoke in global business language and avoided visible displays of heritage.
I see you found the place.
Older structures
Down there is the
remained,
operation.
And memory never fully disappears in places built on it.
I see you
One
found
winter
the
evening,
place.
During a
Down
private
there is the
reservation,
operation.
A familiar face appeared among the guests. The younger
I see
man,
you found
and
the
not
place.
younger anymore.
Down there is
His
the
posture was
operation.
heavier, his expression more deliberate. He carried
I see you
himself
found the
differently now,
place.
not as
Down
someone
there is the
assessing
operation.
power, but as someone carrying it. He chose a table
I see
near
you
the
found the
window.
place.
When she
Down
approached,
there is the
he didn't
operation.
pretend not to know her. "It's been a while," he said evenly.
I see you
She
found the
nodded.
place.
"And you look
Down
different,"
there
she
is the
replied. He
operation.
almost smiled. "We all do." The conversation
I
that
see you
followed was
found the
quiet and
place.
careful.
Down
He
there
spoke
is
of
the
expansion,
operation.
of new projects, and of modern structures
I see
replacing
you
old
found the
systems.
place.
His
Down
tone
there
carried
is the
confidence,
operation.
but not arrogance. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do you still speak it?" And she understood immediately what he meant. "Not often," she said. He studied her face. Good. There was no malice in the word. Only calculation. He wasn't rejecting heritage, and he was containing it. Because he understood what his predecessor had perhaps underestimated. Symbols can inspire loyalty, but they can also destabilize transitions. And as the meal ended, he paused before standing. "You were never meant to be part of it," he said quietly. Part of what? The shift. He left without further explanation, and that night, she walked home through steady snowfall. The city felt quieter, insulated. She thought about the estate gatherings, the warehouse office, the olive branches, and she thought about how close she had come to being drawn into something permanent, and how carefully she had avoided it. Not through strategy, but through restraint, and she had never called the number. She had never leveraged the association. She had simply continued working, serving,
Good evening,
listening,
sir.
and existing
A
in the
greeting can
space
change
between
everything.
visibility and invisibility. That space turned out to be powerful.
Good evening, sir.
Because while power
greeting
seeks
can change
alignment,
everything.
and it rarely knows how to respond to neutrality. Months
evening,
later,
sir.
the restaurant changed
A
ownership.
greeting can change everything.
Officially, it was a business decision. Privately, and it was
Good
part
evening,
of a
sir.
broader restructuring
A
of
greeting can
influence
change
across
everything.
the district. The new owners retained most of the staff,
Good evening, sir.
including her.
A
But the
greeting can
atmosphere
change
shifted,
everything.
and the new management was efficient, corporate, focused
evening,
on branding
sir.
rather than
A
reputation.
greeting can
They
change
spoke
everything.
in numbers, not in stories. And slowly, and
Good
the
evening,
older
sir.
guests who once filled
A
the back
greeting can
tables
change
stopped
everything.
coming. The private dining room that had once hosted
Good
quiet
evening, sir.
gatherings became a storage
greeting
area
can
for
change
extra
everything.
chairs, and the coded language faded. The weight in the air
Good
lightened.
evening, sir.
One afternoon
A greeting
during
can change
inventory,
everything.
and she found something tucked into the back of a drawer in the
Good evening,
manager's
sir.
old office.
A greeting can
envelope,
change everything.
Unopened. Her name written on it in careful script, and the handwriting was unmistakable. Her hands hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, and just one sentence written in dialect. Translation wasn't necessary. It said, "Remember where you stand. Not where you belong, where you stand." The distinction mattered, and belonging implies alignment. Standing implies choice. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her bag. She didn't tell anyone. Years moved on. The city expanded, and the docks automated. The estate outside the city eventually sold quietly to a development firm. The old guard faded into retirement, memory, or absence, and the younger leadership matured into something more structured, less theatrical. And the story of the greeting became something else entirely. Not a symbol of loyalty, and not a political moment, but a reminder that authenticity carries weight in environments obsessed with perception. One evening, and long after the tension had dissolved into history, a tourist couple entered the restaurant. They struggled with pronunciation while ordering, and laughing at their own mistakes. As she brought their plates, the woman apologized for mispronouncing a regional phrase she had read in a travel guide, and it was Sicilian dialect, broken, imperfect, but earnest. The woman asked if she had said it correctly. For a brief moment, the room felt like it once had. Not frozen, but attentive. She smiled gently. Then, in flawless dialect, she corrected the phrase. Softly, naturally, without hesitation. The couple beamed, grateful, and around the restaurant, no one stiffened. No silence spread. It was just language again. Later that night, as she closed the restaurant, and she stood alone near the entrance where the old man had once paused. The door opened and closed with the same quiet sound. But the weight behind it was gone, and power had shifted. Generations had transitioned. Influence had reorganized itself into modern forms. Yet the memory of that frozen moment remained, not as fear, and not as warning, but as understanding. She finally understood what the old man had meant when he spoke of roots. Roots aren't chains. They are anchors, and anchors can stabilize. But they can also hold you in place if you're not careful. She had chosen movement over alignment, distance over leverage, language over loyalty, and in doing so, she had navigated a world built on quiet influence without becoming part of it. The greeting that once froze a room now lived only in memory. But memory, and, when carried wisely, doesn't control you. It informs you. And as the lights dimmed and the city hummed beyond the glass, she locked the door gently, stepped into the night, and walked forward, carrying her origins not as signal, but as something entirely her own. Years later, when people spoke about that era in quiet tones, and the story always sounded larger than it had felt in the moment, they talked about influence, about shifts in leadership, about tradition colliding with modernization, but no one truly understood how small it had started. A door opening, a glance held half a second too long, and a greeting spoken in the language of olive groves and stone courtyards. She never returned to the village near Palermo.
Gentlemen,
not physically,
a message from
but
the
she
family.
didn't need to. And because the village had followed her, not in danger, not in obligation, but
Gentlemen,
in memory,
a message
the
from the
restaurant
family.
eventually rebranded. New signage, new menu. A softer and
Gentlemen,
more international
a message
aesthetic.
from the family.
The private dining room was remodeled into open wine display. The staff changed.
Gentlemen,
Faces
a message
came and
from the
went.
family.
She stayed, and not out of loyalty to any family, not out of attachment to any
Gentlemen,
network,
a message
but because
from
it
the
was her
family.
life, her work, her choice. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, and
Gentlemen,
an older
a
guest would
message
sit
from the
near the
family.
window and watch her move through the room with calm efficiency. There would be a
Gentlemen,
flicker of
a
recognition,
message from the family.
not of power, of history, and they would never speak about it directly.
Gentlemen,
There were no more
a
black
message
cars,
from the family.
no more envelopes, no more silent tests, and the world that
Gentlemen,
had once measured
a
her by a
message from the
dialect
family.
greeting had adapted, dissolved, restructured itself into something less
Gentlemen,
visible and
a
less
message from
personal.
the family.
But influence has a long memory, and so do people. One late summer night, as the city air carried the faint scent of the sea, and a group of young professionals entered the restaurant. Confident, ambitious, speaking loudly about startups, investments, expansion. A different generation, and a different language. They ordered in English, joked in standard Italian, referenced global markets. At one point, one of them attempted a phrase in Sicilian and misremembered from a grandmother long gone. The others laughed. She paused beside the table. For just a second, she considered correcting him. Not to assert anything, and not to revive anything, just to honor it. Instead, she let the mistake pass, because this moment didn't require correction. It required understanding, and the dialect no longer needed to freeze rooms to be powerful. It simply existed, and so did she. After closing that night, she stood again by the door, and the same place where everything had once shifted. The city outside felt ordinary. Cars passed without meaning. Strangers walked by without glancing in. No one watched.
I see
and
you
no one
found the
measured.
place.
No one
Down
waited.
there is the
She
operation.
realized something then that she hadn't fully grasped before.
I
And
see you
the most
found the
powerful
place.
position
Down
she
there
had
is the
ever held
operation.
wasn't the one others imagined. It was the one she chose.
I see you found the
She had been
place.
close enough
Down
to
there is the
influence to
operation.
understand it, and close enough to danger to recognize it.
I see you
and
found
wise
the
enough to
place.
step sideways
Down there is the
instead of
operation.
forward. The greeting that once echoed through a room had
I
not
see you
tied her
found
to
the
anyone,
place.
and it had
Down there is
revealed
the
her,
operation.
revealed where she came from, revealed that she could
I see
carry
you
it
found the
without surrendering
place.
to it.
Down there is
Some
the
roots are
operation.
never cut, but they don't have to trap you either.
I see you
They
found
can
the
simply
place.
remind you who
Down
you
there
are,
is the
even
operation.
when rooms grow silent. She turned the key, locked
I
the
see
door
you
behind
found the
her,
place.
and walked
Down
into
there
the
is the
night without
operation.
hesitation. Not as a symbol, not as a symbol, not as someone aligned, just as herself. And this time, when the door closed, and the room stayed warm. And sometimes, the most powerful thing in a room isn't the person with influence. It's the one who knows exactly who they are and doesn't bend.